Well, as we look at the next two verses, verse 24 and 25 in Proverbs 11, Solomon begins to focus on a lifestyle choice called generosity. And I say a lifestyle choice because in a general sense, we make a decision whether we're going to live with a generous attitude towards every people around us, or a selfish attitude towards other people. But here's what Solomon says. He says, one person gives freely and yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper, and whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Now, the New Living Translation is a little bit more pedestrian, if you will. It reads this way: give freely and become more wealthy. Be stingy and lose everything. The generous will prosper, and those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. You're going to say that if you want to become wealthy, you have to learn to save your money and store it up and become prosperous. In fact, I just read a little thing today, somebody posted and saying that the secret to wealth is not to spend your money. And to some degree, I agree with that. I mean, so much of our spending is just self-indulgent. I mean, we just buy things that we don't need, and sometimes we even buy things that we don't necessarily even want. We just buy them because we can. And that usually is a case of somebody who's never been in a situation where they couldn't afford to buy much of anything. So my wife and I, in the early years of our, most of the first 20 or 30 years of our life, were really kind of, well, some people said we were low income. We didn't really think we were poor because we always had enough, and God seemed to always meet every need. So we didn't view ourselves as being impoverished. I think our kids may have felt that way because their friends had a whole lot more stuff than they had. But it was one of those things that we really had defined in our hearts, that it wasn't about how much you had. It's the fact that you had what God was going to give you, and we were going to content ourselves with that. And I think that one of the things that becomes really was an important decision for us is when we decided that we were going to tithe on our income, as meager as it was. And I remember looking at our income and saying, I don't even make enough money to cover my expenses right now. And now you're asking me, God, to give you 10% of that? And it was really a challenge of faith. My wife always had more faith than I did, but I thought, okay, Lord, I'm gonna try this. And you said, prove me in this in Malachi and see if I won't pour out a blessing. So God said, God, I'm gonna give it I'm gonna try it out. And if I give you 10% and I am coming up short, then I'm gonna stop doing it. So there's a deal, God. Take it or leave it. Yeah, that's how bad I was. Anyway, it blew me away. Because what I found was that God could make that 90% go much further than the 100% could ever go. And it came in strange ways I hadn't understood. It's like, instead of giving you more money, God just gave you more stuff for less money. I mean, we would come across things, and there were people who were generous to us. They saw our needs and said, hey, God just put it on our heart to bless you in this way and that way. And it came in financial gifts. It came in gifts in kind. It came in just people helping out in some very important ways. And it's one of those things that you begin to realize that if you live your life hoarding and hanging on to what you have because you're afraid that you won't have enough to make it to the end, you may be in that situation you're in right now because you're holding it too tightly. Somebody once said it's like kind of trying to grasp sand in your hand, and the tighter you squeeze it, the more it falls out. And I think that's the way with people who hoard, because one of the things, I have known people who save every penny they have, and some of them have become extremely wealthy, but in a way, they're some of the most miserable people I've ever known, because they hold on to the money because they live in fear of not having money. They spend all of their time worrying about their money and where it is, and being afraid and believing that people are trying to cheat them and rip them off. And I mean, it's exhausting. And it's one of those kind of things. I don't say that we should suddenly be foolish and throw our money around, but at the same time, God has called us into a kind of spiritual freedom in our life where we trust him for what we have. And if somebody takes advantage of us and rips us off, it's painful and it's regretful, but more for them than it even is for us, because God has a way of taking care of us. And I think that's just a freedom that very few people anymore have. So we live in this day and age where people are pretty obsessed with preparing for retirement. And I want to be careful here, because I think you should prepare for retirement. I think that that's a responsibility. I think that's an obligation. But I've also known people who suddenly had all of that disappear because of where their money was invested. Something that they were told is AAA rated, and suddenly it's gone. By no fault of their own, they trusted people who were supposed to know well and know better. And what do you do at that moment? Do you say, God failed me? Or do you say, God may have given me an opportunity? I remember talking with a couple one time. This gentleman had created drill bits for, I guess that's what it's called, for oil drilling derricks. And he had built this whole business and everything was roaring. And then suddenly I don't know if you remember, back in the early 80s, the whole oil market fell apart. He lost his entire business, lost everything. And they were volunteering at a Christian camp. And as I was talking with them and they were telling my story, I felt so terrible for them. And they said, the wonderful thing about it is that suddenly we were free to say, God, okay, we've lost everything. Whatever you want to do with us, we're open. And here they were serving in this capacity in a Christian camp that they wouldn't have been available to do if they still had their business. But since it was all gone, they said, why not? And they found more joy in what they were doing than they did in all of their prosperity. So I know it works. And I know that when you trust God, God takes care of you. And that's part of this idea of being a generous person. Because sometimes when we don't have a whole lot and somebody comes to us who doesn't have anything, the challenge is to pretend like we can't help them. But many times I've had God just put it in my heart and saying, don't be stingy, don't hang on to it. Share what you have with them, because God sees that and he will refresh you. And that's the whole idea. He says, whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. That's what I want. I want to be refreshed. And so how do I get there? By being generous and share with others. It's such a simple formula, not easy always to do. But God says, test me and prove me and see if I won't pour out a blessing more than you can contain. Well, I'll finish there. We'll pick this up tomorrow. God bless you and go in his grace.